Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Hello, my lovely listening friends. Welcome to the second episode of Delingpole on Podcast 1. We call it Delingpole because it features me, James Delingpole, talking in my Delingpolish way about Delingpolish stuff with Delingpole-friendly guests like... Well, this week's guest is a very special treat. Her name is Claire Fox. She's a broadcaster, she's a polemicist, she's a regular on the BBC's Moral Maze programme, and I love her very much, despite the fact that she's a lefty feminist who looks a little bit like a lesbian. No, that's wrong. One of the reasons I love her so very much is precisely because she's a left-wing feminist who looks a little bit like a lesbian, but one who happens to be almost totally on my side of the political argument. Seriously, she's like a cross between Margaret Thatcher and Sarah Palin and Katie Hopkins, only trapped in a left-wing woman's body. How can this be, you'll wonder? Well, it is, I grant you, a strange one. When she was a student, Claire was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party and remained one of their core activists for 20 years. She was also the publisher of the group's magazine, Living Marxism, which eventually closed in 2000 after it lost a very expensive libel case. Now here's the strange thing. Many of the writers and thinkers who were associated with that magazine have since become my staunchest allies in the culture wars. It's a bit like that time in World War II when we fought shoulder to shoulder with the Reds against the Nazis. Well, almost, except in this particular case I can honestly say that the Reds, in this case Claire, are actually better than our own people. Seriously, one of the major problems I have with so many of my notionally conservative comrades in the media and politics is that they're not real conservatives at all. They're what some of you might think of as cucks, and what I'd call spineless, malleable, principle-free, lightweight, cowardly, bastard, no-testicles, scumbag tossers. Not to their face, obviously. One of the big mistakes we make on the right side of the argument, it seems to me, is that we're forever throwing our comrades to the wolves for one petty reason or another, whereas clearly, if you're going to defeat the enemy, you need unity. This is what I was trying to explain to my audience at the Battle of Ideas the other weekend. The Battle of Ideas is a debating event which Claire organises in London every year, featuring a lot of her old comrades from her Revolutionary Communist Party days. There's Brendan O'Neill from Spiked, ex-Times columnist Mick Hume, Professor Frank Furedi, and so on. I expect I'll be talking to some of them in upcoming podcasts. Another of their number is my favourite documentary maker, Martin Durkin, the guy who made Brexit the movie. Now, to cut to the chase, what's interesting about all these people is that despite being, notionally at least, revolutionary communists, they're actually closer to my own ideological position than most conservatives I know. That is, they are passionately against big government, especially in its nanny state mode where it wants to police every last detail of our personal morality. And they're also passionately pro-free speech. So I was talking to the audience at the Battle of Ideas, and you never know where you are with Battle of Ideas audiences. Some are libertarians, some are closet conservatives, but most of them, I suspect, would like to think of themselves as being on the left rather than on the right. And what I said to these people was, look, stop worrying about labels. It doesn't matter if somebody's on the left or if they're on the right. What matters is the quality of their ideas. I think this is especially important in the war against what I would regard as perhaps the greatest threat, certainly the most insidious threat of the modern age. I'm talking about social justice warriors in all their various hideous manifestations. The green SJWs who want to close down the economy, the feminist SJWs who want to pathologise all male behaviour to the point where being a man is almost a crime, the race-baiting SJWs in movements like Black Lives Matter and Roads Must Fall, who want to trigger a race war, the lifestyle SJWs who want to ban all forms of fun, the anti-free speech SJWs who want us to believe that saying a bad thing is as bad as doing a bad thing, and so on and so forth. Doesn't matter whether you're a conservatarian like me or a revolutionary Marxist like Claire. These people, the SJWs, are our common enemy, and we should unite against them, just like the Soviets teamed up with Captain Constanta and his Romanian vampires in Fiends of the Eastern Front. If you don't know what Fiends of the Eastern Front is, by the way, just Google it. It's great. You're in for a treat. So anyway, enough preamble. I'd like to thank very much my podcast hosts, Podcast One, for hosting this show. I'd like to thank Breitbart for giving me the chance to do this thing. And most of all, I would like to thank you, my lovely, lovely listener friends, for your loyalty, for your company, and of course for the 5-star review that you're going to give me on iTunes. Enjoy the show. It's quite weird that Claire is a friend of mine, because, I mean, in many respects you are a bit of a lefty, aren't you, Claire?
I am definitely a lefty. I consider myself not just from the tradition, but having never really left it. However, I do understand that these days most of the people that I critique are on the left, so it's a burden having the label.
Well, isn't it weird that, I mean, you now, how do you describe yourself? How do you describe what you do?
Well, I'm just so reluctant to use some of the labels that float around. I mean, I'm described as a left-wing libertarian. I think the most important principles for me are freedom, free individual. But I always thought that when I was involved in the Revolutionary Communist Party, when I was the publisher of LM magazine, which has been Living Marxism.
Living Marxism.
So that kind of commitment to freedom is not something that's kind of a recent acquisition.
But here we are. People are going to be gobsmacked at this. That I'm sitting down talking to, for my first podcast for a right-wing website, I'm talking to a former revolutionary Marxist. And yet, you and I agree on so much more than we disagree. And there are many, many conservatives out there whom I loathe because they don't seem to me sufficiently conservative, whereas I see you and I, we're in the same pretty much ideological tradition.
Well, I think that what's changed over the last 10, maybe 15 years is something that I've had, it's been bitter to accept, but nonetheless it's true, is that the previous political camps and the way they were organised are just no use to us anymore. So what I now do is I actually listen to what people say, and if I agree with them, I say, I agree with you, and if I disagree with someone, I say, I disagree with you, and that can mean that I've fallen out with allies and I have strange bedfellows. So I've stopped worrying about it so much. I don't want to be embarrassed that I agree with somebody I apparently objectively shouldn't agree with, because if we agree, we agree, and then on that particular issue, that's the key question.
There are certainly loads of left-wing people out there who would go, you're hanging out with James Delingpole. How can you even associate with such a kind of person?
Mind you, that's an open question, isn't it? But this is more the way it works. People will say to me, you sound like you're the Daily Mail, and this is meant to kind of shut you up. This is kind of like the worst insult, you know. Or you sound as though you're kind of a James Delingpole type, or you sound as though you're a Spectator type, or you sound, you know, and these are kind of meant to be, it's not just an accusation, it's meant to embarrass you into changing your position. And also, that's what I object to. Also,
it's an effective way of closing down the argument. I don't need to talk to you because you are Daily Mail or you are James Delingpole. And we all know, we civilised people, that those are bad things. Therefore, I needn't take this argument any further, and I needn't have my argument tested in any way.
Exactly. And I think that, by the way, that happens both ways. I mean, there are people, as it were, from the traditional right, who will say to me, oh, well, you're a Marxist. And then they immediately make assumptions about what and then they're kind of looking at me like going, oh, you didn't say what I thought you were going to say. But it's almost as though they've made so many assumptions beforehand that the debate is closed. But I agree with you, it tends to be the other way around these days. It's more the kind of, what I would describe a kind of cultural leftism that has become completely intolerant of anything that's not within its own echo chamber, and that's very dangerous.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to talk to you because there's so much I could talk to you about today, and maybe we'll talk about some of those things later on. But I first wanted to talk about this brilliant book you've written called "I Find That Offensive," which is about special snowflakes, about SJWs, social justice warriors, and this terrifying problem that our generation, I mean, I'm early 50s, I don't know how old are you?
That category.
That category. And I don't know about you, Claire, but I look at this modern world and I look at the kind of shit that the kids are saying and I think, what, you horrible little monsters. What, this mixture of sort of entitlement, arrogance, victimhood.
So why I wrote the book was, it's a short book and I only had a limited amount of space to say something, and I thought there's been very many brilliant books written on free speech and the fine tradition of free speech.
Yeah.
And I couldn't better them or say anything original. But I have, however, over the last few years particularly worked with and done lots of talks to and associated myself, because I'm particularly interested in young people and politics and so on. And so it's been a great dismay to me to watch the young generations becoming quite so explicitly thin-skinned, easily offended, and the leadership of the kind of censorship brigade.
Yeah.
And that's quite a horrifying thing. I do think it's generational, which is what the book argues. It's a difficult thing to do, because if you're a middle-aged woman and you wander around saying that kids are all being hopeless, you can imagine that this will somehow everyone just go, oh, is a middle-aged woman moaning about young people again? Yeah. A kind of fogey-ish argument. But actually, and it's been gratifying to note this, that since the book's come out, the people who've most enjoyed it have been young. Because I think there's a recognition amongst many young people that their generation are actually particularly thin-skinned, and it's of some concern to them. So even though it's a generational trend, I obviously don't mean all young people, but it is a generational trend, and I wanted to try and understand why. And it's true that I felt exactly as you've said. You get exasperated and annoyed and infuriated, and you kind of go, what is wrong with you? And that's what I tried to investigate. And then I realised that actually they were simply ventriloquising our generation's prejudices. Yeah.
Well, I want to come to that bit a bit later on. We first of all outline the problem, because I read this book and I was horror-struck, actually, by your description of your visits to two separate schools. And I was thinking, hang on a second, is this Britain in 2016, or is this China in the era of the Cultural Revolution? Just briefly tell me about those experiences.
So I went to one school which is over 90% Muslim school, and I was invited to speak to the sixth form on free speech post Charlie Hebdo.
Yeah.
And actually, to give credit to the head of sixth form and the teachers, they wanted me to go, and they knew there'd be a row.
Were the teachers all Muslims as well?
No, mixture.
Right.
Somebody had heard me on the Moral Maze making an argument, and thought it would be good to shake up the debate in the sixth form by getting me to come in. So I went and spoke to the sixth form. And they didn't agree with me, and that's fine. And, you're allowed. But what was remarkable was that it wasn't that they didn't agree with me. You're allowed to not agree with me. But they were outraged that I was saying what I was saying. And there was a real sort of sense of, you can't say that throughout.
Yeah.
And then it came to a head when I basically, in answering a question, said something along the lines of, well, I don't care whether there's a picture of Muhammad on the front cover or and everybody gasped, because apparently I hadn't said the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
And I'd made some terrible religious faux pas. So I said, look, I'm not a theologian, you know what I mean, I'm here to talk about free speech, I don't understand. But there was, gasps, and people were close to tears, and people were saying, that's Islamophobic, and you've hurt me so much.
They were close to tears because you hadn't said the Prophet Muhammad.
And then I wouldn't back off. That's the significant thing.
Right.
Not saying it led to the first reaction.
Yeah.
The particular outrage was because I then wouldn't say, I am sorry. I wasn't trying to be argumentative, but I was just saying, come on, in good faith, you know that this is an argument about free speech.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to couch it in the terms that you want me to.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to. And so there was a big argument and a big row. And the reason why I tell that story in more detail in the book that I'm doing now is that when I then told colleagues about it, immediately everybody started saying to me, oh, that's the problem with young Muslims today, it's the Quran, it's Islamicism, it's all of this. And I said, yes, but the problem is, I did a talk 3 days ago at another sixth form, and I had exactly the same response. But guess what? That school was a school at which I was invited to debate whether a footballer who'd been accused of and had just spent time in prison for rape,
Ched Evans.
Ched Evans, should be allowed to play football, and there was a debate about rehabilitation or not. And I feel very strongly that once you're out of prison, you've done your time, and that you should be given a second chance.
Yeah.
And I had gone and argued this at another sixth form, had no Muslims in the sixth form as far as I could tell,
Yeah.
in which I was greeted with equal outrage that I was making this argument by the sixth form feminist society and by various people. And in that instance it had particularly come to a head when, in an attempt at explaining to these young people who seemed to me in a state of terror about the idea that there was a rapist round every corner,
Yeah.
and that everything was rape, and that anyway, and every rapist should be denied every civil liberty, and even stopped from having children and locked up forever. And I thought, these girls particularly are frightened. So I said, look, I also want to say to you that, you know, if you are raped, which is very rare, it's not the worst thing that's ever going to happen to you. And they also, I mean, there was squeals, cries,
Right.
just as in the other school. And people saying, oh my God, you can't say that. This is, tears, you know. And the reaction was very similar in both instances, which was not to argue against me, but to be outraged by what I'd said, and then to demand that I stop saying it. And then when I carried on trying to argue it, a kind of real attempt to close me down. You know, because people were saying, that's just so offensive. You can't say that. That's terrible. I'm so upset. You've hurt my... And they all kept saying, in both schools, by the way, but you've got to understand either, you know, when I hear that the Prophet Muhammad has been insulted, I feel that personally. It destroys me. And in the other school they were saying, but when you say that, I mean, I personally, just my stomach, I feel ill that you've said that about rape, and I can't cope. And I thought, God, if I can't cope with somebody having an argument in the sixth form, we're in trouble. So I used those two stories to illustrate the problem.
This does rather put into context an experience I had when I went to speak at the Oxford Union a few months ago. And I rolled up, sort of nervous and sort of probably not as well prepared as I should be, but I was thinking I'll rely on my sort of self-deprecating manner and my good humour and stuff to win over this student audience. So I had my speech all prepared, and this is my third time I've debated at the Oxford Union, and my turn came, and I get dry-throated before a debate, and there wasn't any water, and so I had to reach over to one of the union secretary or the treasurer or whatever, and they passed me this half-drunk bottle, and so I looked at this half-drunk bottle and I said, I hope you haven't got AIDS. Now, in the old days, this would have been a kind of a bit of business before the show kind of thing, and people would have laughed at this rather ridiculous person worrying about AIDS, and it was all sort of in inverted commas. It was all not serious, but a significant chunk of the audience was so appalled that I should make a joke about AIDS that basically I was lost for the rest of the evening. I really felt these kids had turned on me. Now, I can understand that somewhere thick, somewhere not Oxford, you know, but this is one of the two top universities in the country, and I thought that people would be capable of differentiating between kind of genuine verbal hate crime or whatever and a throwaway remark, and they weren't.
No, but I think that's first of all, I am inevitably going to object to the idea that if they were thick, Because actually it's at the most elite universities that you'll find these prejudices far more prevalent than anywhere else.
Is that right? Why is that?
Because they're the kind of people who are leading the theoretical assault. I mean, they're far more sensitive than anyone else because they've kind of theorised this whole thin-skinnedness. So they're, ever vigilant on language crimes and hate, hatred in their different guises and offendedness and so on. But what I think is really fascinating is that this generation of young people are so ill-equipped at dealing with jokes.
Yeah, jokes.
Off the cuff comments, people saying the wrong thing. People do trip up and say the wrong things. People do react and sort of say things in the heat of the moment.
Or when they're nervous, or...
That's what spontaneous speech is like.
Yeah.
That's actually what interaction between human beings is like.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible idea that what they want is everything to be so polished and poised that you have no room for slipping up. In other words, there's only one argument allowed and it can only be said in a particular way.
Yeah.
In other words, it's the end and the death of politics and debate.
Yeah.
And for me, that, of course, was what my great concern was, because I think it's entirely appropriate that an outside speaker goes, but sixth form and gets a hard time after sixth form. I don't want them all sitting there nodding at me. I mean, that would be hopeless. I mean, I want them to be critical thinkers. I'm prepared to accept that some of my arguments were and are controversial, and I expect them to say yes. But what about this? What about that? But they didn't do that. They basically said you can't say that, and that's a very different atmosphere. And then to basically say that they were slighted and that they were hurt personally. And that then starts to be quite a nerve-wracking experience, because then you're basically being told that you've gone in and damaged these 17-year-olds, that you've hurt their psyche, and that actually you've got to kind of watch what you say and kind of walk on eggshells. And that means that you actually become so nervous that you can't say anything.
Yeah.
And also it means that they never hear anything, and they become unaccustomed to hearing anything other than a kind of warm gush of pandering to their prejudices that they presently have, because that's the only thing that they'll accept.
And this is not just a UK problem, is it? I mean, it's is it even worse in the US?
Perhaps? Oh, it's much worse in the US. I mean, I have to say that the US, there's hard to imagine land of the free, but certainly in the university sector and schools, this has become rampant. There are kickbacks now. There are university vice chancellors who are coming out, but they're coming out. Like, I think the University of Chicago just come out and said, this is a university, you should not expect to only hear views that you agree with. But the fact that they have to say it, the fact that President Obama had to say to a group of students, you should listen to people with other opinions, the fact that anyone has to say to anyone that this... in America, it's become so toxic that it is very difficult to go into any university now and not offend somebody. And the consequences of this is the point is, I think that when I was writing this book as well, there was quite a few people who wanted to sort of say, was this just silly student politics? This is kind of daft student people, like, we don't have to say, this isn't a serious matter for you, Claire, as the Institute of Ideas. What about serious politics?
Yep. What
I'd say is that this is damaging political discourse much more broadly than on campuses. And also, it's, as a generational shift, means that everyone who goes into work, goes into politics, have been reared on this stuff, right? And it will have an incredibly damaging impact on the way we conduct any kind of social change or political discussion in the future.
This is Delingpole. More to come in a moment with Claire Fox. I'm James Delingpole, and you're going to love my podcast, Delingpole. We'll talk politics, movies, music, or something really trivial that's pissing me off. Thursdays on my podcast, Delingpole.
I'm A.W.R. Hawkins from Breitbart.com. I love guns because I love freedom, and I hate liberalism. Join me on my podcast, Bullets, on Tuesdays on the Breitbart Podcast Network. Brought to you by PodcastOne.com.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
So I'm talking to my former Marxist friend Claire Fox about...
I can't work out whether that's former Marxist or former friend.
Yeah, you'll always be my friend, Claire. About these sodding special snowflakes and social justice warriors, and how how the kids of today have turned into these, like, Maoist revolutionaries, and yet sensitive as well, overly sensitive. There were some very good examples in your book. I find that offensive on what's going on in the US. Can you remember any of them? I mean, absolute insanity, I seem to recall.
Well, there are far too many examples, but the thing which really kind of drew international attention to this was the arguments around the banning of, or whether there should be sensitivity around wearing Halloween costumes.
That's right.
At Yale, and
clearly the answer is no, because I mean,
no, because Halloween costumes of all things are likely to offend a range of different cultural groups, allegedly, because
Wiccans?
People, yes, exactly. I mean, God knows. I couldn't even work out what it was we were meant to be worried about, but you know that you get to this point. But the reason why that hit the headlines was because the dean of the college's wife sent an email around to the students saying, look, I think we should all calm down about this, and she actually wrote a fantastic email. Actually, it was a really kind of erudite exposition of, you know, when we were young, everyone was trying to protect us and tell us not to take risks, and now you seem to be the ones who kind of saying don't wear this and don't wear that, and maybe we should all just accept it, and even if you're offended by something, you know, you'll get over it. Anyway, this caused even more outrage. But the thing that then happened was there was a filmed confrontation between the dean and the students, and the students in that instance were like screaming at the dean, and they kept saying, this is a safe space and we demand to be protected. And I think that if there's a model anywhere, this is the thing which has emerged, which is we demand to be protected and we demand safety, has been the major thing that comes out of all of these arguments. So whether it's arguments about statues, not just at Oriel College in Oxford, but also there's been all manner of plaques and statues in America that have caused offence, because obviously the whole of America is dedicated in many ways historically to people who will have one way or another been associated with the slave trade.
Funny that.
What are you going to do? And you know, everybody kind of trying to find something that they find particularly offensive. There's a competition for offence, but you know, recently we've had this instance in Australia of the novelist.
Lionel Shriver.
Sorry, Lionel Shriver giving her speech about identity politics and cultural appropriation by wearing a sombrero.
Yes.
To illustrate the point about the way that tequila themed drinks parties at student unions have been closed down because that would be seen as being offensive to Mexicans. Sushi banned on the basis that it's offensive.
Can we not eat sushi?
We can't. There's in America, but it's happening here as well. Some of the most vicious rows are happening about what food is served in university canteens. I mean, unbelievably petty in many ways, and yet that's been the kind of argument.
But isn't the corollary of that argument that Japanese students, okay, it's okay for them to eat sushi, but they really can't eat burgers?
One wouldn't want to explore with any depth or rational interrogation what goes on. Because exactly, you know, are we saying that Japanese students can only eat sushi then? I mean, that would be the kind of...
And whale meat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, if you're going to confine people, but it's this, of course, you're misunderstanding, because it's all to do with the power structures, James. And therefore, as the dominant power in America is white, it's kind of it's the white America appropriating cultures that are not equal in American society.
Do you know, by the way, just to interlude, do you know why the Japanese eat whale?
No.
It's not part of their historic tradition. It was in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, when they had a starving population. General MacArthur received the administrator, I think, in America, basically decided to feed them on whale meat in order to give them the necessary protein. And after a few years grumbling, the Japanese acquired a taste for whale meat.
Yeah. But I mean, let's be honest, who knows why any particular nationality is associated with a particular food? I mean, I have to say that I am absolutely incapable of giving up potatoes and bread, and no doubt that's got something to do
That'll
with
be
my
the Irish
roots, the
in you.
Irish roots in me. I like them. You know, potatoes and bread aren't Irish, and we all know that there's kind of like famine reasons. I could maybe say that I'm specially oppressed because I've kind of got this. But the idea that I'm kind of going to say to somebody, "You're eating potatoes," is a sign of oppression of the Irish. But this is where we go. One thing I wanted to contradict in what you said, because one of the reasons...
What? Disagreement?
I want to disagree.
Yeah.
Because one of the things is, you see, this trend is so easy to lampoon as ludicrous, right? It is ludicrous. You've got plaques dedicated to Martin Luther King that are objected to on the basis that he was not inclusive enough in his equal rights. He didn't include disabled people and trans people.
Right.
There have been protests against that. There's been successful attempts in American universities to abolish the term master, as in the master of a college, as in the educational term.
Which sounds like slave master.
Because it denotes slave master.
Yep.
Obviously it's not come from that if you're the master of a college. It's an
Magister.
educational thing, but that hasn't stopped the college authorities saying, yes, you're right, we feel bad about this, we are obviously,
There was somebody who felt uncomfortable about the title dean, wasn't there, at some American university?
I think that might be, I don't know. Anyway, but you've got all of these. We can, and you were talking about that kind of these like horrible little snowflakes. This is the problem I've got. There's a very small section of university campuses here and in the US and actually around Europe now increasingly, and certainly in South Africa, that are almost professional snowflakes, and the term snowflake is an incredibly insulting one, but you can see them, right? They're kind of queuing up to be offended.
Yeah.
My concern is not them. In a way, they're kind of hardcore bureaucrats,
Right.
They're kind of like almost, it's for them a way of drawing attention to themselves. It's almost become a way that if you're going to get elected to the National Union of Students, you're going to actually say, I'm on the side of every single press group, I'm into identity politics, I believe in safe spaces, and I think that we shouldn't platform a whole range of people whose views are offensive. My concern is that there's then this massive other group of students who some people would say, oh no, they're all right, they don't go along with all this. No, that's not true. They are equally thin-skinned, but they just aren't as vociferous. And my concern is how deep this goes, if anything.
Right.
It's not just the hardcore we have to worry about. Now, they don't necessarily go complaining about everything.
Yeah.
But there is a sense of entitlement combined with an entitlement to be heard as a young person. A demand that their views are kind of given precedence that I think we saw in relation to the recent Brexit result. One of the big things that emerged was young people who voted for Remain,
Yep.
which is a very legitimate thing for some young people to do, who said, as a majority of young people voted for Remain, we have been betrayed by old people.
Yes.
And it's like, you're voters. You're not young people. You're just voters.
Yes, their
right?
argument was that because they had to live with the consequences of this old people's decision, that their vote should be privileged over the old. So we're going to die soon, aren't we, Claire? Especially if we smoke.
But there was a genuine demand by these people, that, or rather a complaint that their views had been ignored. There was actually, first of all, you ought to have mobilised more of your colleagues to go out and vote on your side. That would have been helpful. But secondly, anyway, right, if you want to be taken seriously as a young person, you have to see yourself as a citizen, but this was kind of identity politics around age. We the young demand that you give us what we want. And they were genuinely unable, it seemed to me, to understand that they'd lost an argument.
Yes.
In fact, they never had an argument. They are so used to having an assertion as a way of winning that they don't actually know how to put the arguments forward. And I think that it's that broader, more insidious effect that I'm concerned about, because otherwise I think we just end up with a kind of more lampooned, easy to go, what the hell is wrong with them? And of course, most young people aren't like that. Most people think that's mad. But you'll find that the majority of people, if you ask them on university campuses, will say, well, of course, I do think that safe spaces are important. I do think we should platform quite a lot of people. But they might say that the sombrero banning was a bit daft.
Yes, yeah. And you argue in your book that our generation, created these monsters. Just give me some examples of how we've created these special snowflakes.
So my insight is that I wanted to understand why any young person in any generation would leave home and immediately say, I want to feel protected and safe. This seemed to me to be completely counterintuitive to what you'd anticipate a young person to ever want to do. You know, a few years ago I used to lampoon in speeches I gave at universities some, particularly patronising access project, which was about getting working class kids to go to university, which was called Feel at Home Days. And I'd always tell this story and I'd always get a laugh from my student colleagues because, can you imagine anything more ludicrous than going to university and feeling at home? I mean, you go to university to escape home. Now, it's the students who are demanding that they feel safe and homely at universities. So, I was trying to work out why is it that safe spaces, demanding that you feel at home and protected would be what an 18-year-old would do. Why would that happen? And I thought about it and I thought of all the other work I've done over the last few years, which has been on what's happening in education. And one of the things I realised was that we've reared young people into the idea that safety is the thing which trumps all else. Think about it, there's health and safety madness.
Yep.
There's telling children they can't go out to play because they'll be either run over or attacked by a paedophile. We've now got this major problem of cotton wool kids who don't go out to play enough because the parents have kept them in too much. We've got a whole child protection industry that emphasises protecting children from these terrible unknowns and threats, whether they're cyberbullying on the one hand or kind of being groomed on another or what have you. And we also have, even in kind of discourse more broadly, we have everything couched in this kind of catastrophic language of the threat and the need for protection. So you can't have a conversation about the climate without it being kind of, Armageddon's around the corner,
die, yeah.
We're all going to die. You have a conversation about a kind of minor increase in young people's weight, and it's called an obesity time bomb, and we're measuring and weighing children at the age of 4, making them frightened of what they eat.
And also, have we not this whole culture whereby we can't judge people on their appearance anymore has, I'm afraid, created a generation of lard butts. I mean, I was at Glastonbury Festival this year, and I was struck by how many of the... had I been 18 years old, looking around for girls, as potential sexual partners, the talent pool was fairly limited because a lot of these girls have been told it's okay, let yourself go to pieces, be as fat as you like because people can't judge you because that's wrong.
Well, that might be true, although cruel. I've got a different take on it, which is I think if you make young people obsessed with their body, they become obsessed with their body in a way that kind of makes them unnaturally obsessed over food. And, the only time that I ever put on serious amounts of weight when I was young was when I went to university and there was a big notice on the fridge that had calories, what every piece of food was on the calories thing. I didn't know what a calorie was. I'd never thought about weight in my life. And as soon as I saw that, I put on 2 stone or something. It was like it was like the sort of drawing attention to it and everybody being obsessed with it made me worry about it more, which made me ironically eat. And of course, guess how I cut down on the weight was I took to smoking. There you go. That's the unintended consequences of life. But so I think it's complicated. So I don't, whatever about your experiences of Glastonbury. But my concern was just that we're constantly telling them anyway that everything is a threat.
Yeah.
Fatty foods is a threat. Talking to strangers is a threat. Talking to your friends is a threat because we now have peer-to-peer abuse. There's now a big panic going on about sexual abuse. Apparently, it's epidemic in schools. Nonsense. Let me just say, nonsense. That is not true. But it's the broadening out. It's called concept creep, actually. The concepts that we have previously used, which were useful categories to employ, like bullying or harassment or any of these things, have now been stretched and broadened out to such an extent that everything falls into the category, which means that we've reared a generation of young people who are both scared of their shadow.
Yep.
We as adults tell them to be scared. They say, reassure me it's not as bad as all that. And we say it's much worse than that. It's much worse than that. So we frighten the life out of them. And then we'd say, you have to be protected by everything. So we don't then allow them to develop the tools that they will need to cope with what are, after all, the ups and downs of life.
This is Delingpole. More to come in a moment with Claire Fox.
Stay tuned for 60-second AP News headlines.
AP Update, I'm Diane Kepley. Questions are swirling in Washington about the contacts between Trump administration officials and the Russians.
Was General Flynn directed or authorized to do what he did? What was the extent of his conversations and contacts with Russia? Who else from the Trump administration, transition, or campaign had contact with the Russians?
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and others are calling for an independent investigation to get the answers to those questions. There is pushback from President Trump. This morning, he's lashing out at the news media, saying the fake news media is going crazy with what he calls their conspiracy theories and blind hatred. He adds in his tweet, the Russian connection nonsense is an attempt to cover up mistakes made in Hillary Clinton's losing campaign. Meantime, in Moscow, a Kremlin spokesman is denying reports about intercepted phone calls between intelligence officials and members of the Trump presidential campaign. AP Update.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
This is Delingpole, starring my very special guest, Claire Fox. So, Claire, we're talking about special snowflakes and how our generation, your generation and my generation, created these monsters. And you tell a very good story in your book, I find that offensive, about your niece, which illustrates, I think, how the definition of bullying has crept into this all-encompassing. Pretty much everything is bullying now. Tell us about your niece.
My niece, who is now 25 and can't forgive me for writing this story in the book. But anyway, when she was about 10 or 11, I found her in floods of tears, very distraught. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I'm being bullied." And obviously, I was devastated, and I had visions of having her head kicked in for her dinner money being stolen. Yeah. There's nothing worse than this poor distraught child. Anyway, it ended up. So I said to her, "Oh my God, what's happened? Tell me this terrible tale." And she said, that's whoever, Sophie and Jenny or whoever, are going to the pictures on Friday night and they're not taking me. And I said...
Which is what girls do, isn't it?
And I said, well, it's what anyone would. And I said, I don't think that's bullying. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. And she said, no. In a very outraged way. No. That's exclusion from friendship group. She actually used the term exclusion from friendship group.
Yeah.
Now, she was 11 or something. I thought, what? Never heard the term. So I went off and, as you do, Googled. Right? And I discovered that now the definition of bullying in schools includes exclusion from friendship group, which basically means falling out with your mates or them not inviting you to the... Anyway, so I then started to investigate bullying in schools quite a lot because it has become... First of all, it's a statutory obligation to have anti-bullying policies. It's a major, major issue in all schools.
Who invented that? Who with this statutory obligation? When was that brought in?
It was under Labour, but goodness knows it's been strengthened by the Tories every time you
because
look.
I listen to Radio 1 now, which for American listeners is our sort of youth channel, and they're always banging on about bullying in schools and warning kids of the horrors of it.
Everyone is, and that's the irony of it is, by the way, that there's so many celebrities who have come out as being bullied as
who's come out as
well, I can't remember them. I've listed
them
all.
There was Tom Cruise.
Oh, everyone. I've got a list. I honestly can't remember. But weekly there is a celebrity who comes out and said, "I used to be bullied at school." And then by the way, it both glamorises it, but also you think, yeah, and you've got over it, and you're now a celebrity. What are you moaning about? To a certain extent, they're an indication of how you survive it, not an indication of how much you suffer. But anyway, the point is that there isn't a day goes by if you're a kid at school that bullying doesn't come up. It's miraculous to me that more and more kids don't say they're bullied, but it is something ridiculous. Like 70% of young people say they're bullied.
Well, it's like every woman's been raped as well.
Yeah, because if you ask anyone anything like this, and you've also, what I say is we almost incite them. We incite the young to say. We say, this is bullying. And then, obviously, by the way, the young pick up on this stuff, right? So, when then you're a bit fed up and you're falling out with someone and you want to complain about them, you use the language, which is what my niece did. You've adopted this language. You use languages like, I'm very traumatised, so you've got the language, and I'm suffering stress, and I've got anxiety. These are languages, by the way, from the therapeutic world.
Yes, therapy is... Normal behaviour has been pathologised, hasn't it?
That's right, and they picked all this up, and then they say it back to them, and then it gets written down, and it kind of becomes more policy. We've gone off and interviewed people, and they all say... And so, you've got... So now, to be serious, this is the bit that I make as a serious point. Again, I can say, my God, it's ridiculous. All these young people say they're being bullied. We all go on about bullying. We've got this really horrible aspect of this, which is where you have institutionalised lessons in friendship, where they tell you have to be compulsorily friends with people, which I think is the greatest undermining of the notion of an autonomous individual.
And if they're total dweebs, then you should be told they're dweebs, don't they?
Exactly. But also, the dweebs might want to be friends with the dweebs and not be friends with the bikers, right? I don't know. But what I'm saying is you're allowed to choose. This is about growing up. Part of growing up is you say, I like that person, I don't like that person. But it's also about being yourself and learning who you are, developing a person out. Not who you are is who am I looking in, but who am I going to be? Right? What gang am I in? Right?
Yeah.
That's part of it, and that has to therefore be exclusive or exclusionary, because you then say, I don't want to go around with the girls who like that group. I mean, for me, it was often music. I was kind of the girl who was going to wear the check shirts and the Levi jeans and be the slightly, we like, Bowie and Neil Young, and then went off and was a punk, right? And then I was a punk as distinct from being into. Yes. I mean, what I'm saying is you make choices. That's there. Yeah, that shows how old I am. But
Claire Fox, were forged by bullying, in one way or another.
In the way that
by your rejection.
By my rejection.
In a good way. And
exactly.
I was too. I mean, you and I suspect, were not the kind of people who hung about with the jocks at school, because I was never very sporty.
No, our school wasn't very sporty, but I don't think there were any jobs. No, Ian Rush went to school with me. That was as close as we got, and he's a famous footballer for anyone who doesn't know.
But I mean, your species, I have to say, is particularly bad on this. I mean, I look at what my daughter has to endure as a girl, and the rather really, really good-looking girls who lose their virginity earlier. They're the cool set, and if you're not part of the cool set, then you are completely stuffed. But then what you do, if you're not part of that cool set, is you find your own direction, and you discover kind of independent music or whatever, or you become...
So anyway, one way or another, you forge your way through this growing up period, and in order to do that, actually, you have to have a certain amount of independence. You have to have a certain amount of freedom. Now, I know children can't have total freedom, and I'm not a children's rights advocate by any stretch of the imagination, but you have to have areas where you can say, I like that person, I don't like that person, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. So the idea that schools now teach friendship and tell you that if you exclude someone as a friend that you're bullying them, it seems to me to be an incredible encroachment on their autonomy and their sense of autonomy. But also there's a very serious thing, which is if you rear a generation of young people to imagine that words are as dangerous, as damaging, or as being
as physical violence,
your head beaten in every day, right? Then actually you absolutely make those young people less resilient.
Well, we had a phrase, didn't we?
They can't cope then when, and so I quote actually an American bullying, somebody who works with kids who are bullied, who says the problem we've now got is that kids actually now can't cope with words. Right, and they can't cope, and then that actually does make them, panic. They think if they've been bullied, if somebody says something horrible, they've been told by all these bullying professionals, anti-bullying professionals, that it's going to destroy their life. I mean, there are organisations in this country who say if you are bullied as a young person, it will mean that you will end up as a drug-addled, unemployed, mentally ill person. It will destroy your life and make you miserable forever. So if you're 14 and you're bullied and you think that's your prospects, that would actually make you more depressed and more fed up. So when these people, I think it's irresponsible, in other words, it actually genuinely opens young people up to not being able to cope.
I couldn't believe this when I read it, but you and I used to have a phrase at school, I don't know whether it's the case in America as well, but sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And whenever anyone said anything horrible to you, you just said that mantra, and it made the bad stuff go away. Now, children get bullying experts who come around. I mean, there's a whole industry, isn't there, out there? Bullying expert, and this ties in with all the schools' anti-bullying policies. So they're obliged to have these idiots, this industry, come around to their school and give them lectures on how sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can...
Or worse.
Yeah,
because it will psychologically damage you forever.
Yeah.
I mean, your arm is broken, but it will get better. But if a word hurts you, it destroys you forever. I mean, can you imagine anything more negative or damaging for our generation to have told this generation? So then we wonder, right?
Yeah.
So what happens then is, they're reared on this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then this weird other thing is happening. All of that happening, where we're scaring the life out of them, we're telling them they can't cope and they have to be protected. But we're also telling them they're the most important thing in the world. Right, and we preach the politics of self-esteem, and we say you need to be looked after and coddled, and we don't want you to feel hurt any time, so we don't want to have competitive sport or competitive debating. We're going to all must have prizes. So and so feels left out, so we must bring them in. We must make. So what you then do is and also there's advice. I mean, alongside all of this, there's advice given to parents. You mustn't disagree with your young children. You must encourage them. You must never use negative criticism. Teachers are told that if they're going to criticise, it has to always be constructive. In fact, they shouldn't really criticise. They should always encourage. So you kind of create these thin-skinned, scared kids, combined with these kids who think that they are the most important person in the world. Everything is theirs, right? And it's all about them. The me generation. So there's nothing more toxic than narcissism combined with, easily offended thin-skinnedness.
No.
And by time they're preloaded with this over-anxious atmosphere, scared of everything, think words are going to, kill them. But also think that they are the centre of the universe, and then they go to university. And guess what? It doesn't work well. And we wonder why, when they get to university, they become the safe spaces. Yeah. So the irony of these young people who think they're great rebels, fighting against the good fight for their generation, is all that they are doing, to go back to what I said earlier, is ventriloquising in a particularly kind of naff, crass, studenty, youthful way, actually all of the messages that they've received from our generation.
Yeah. Well, not you and me, I have to say. That's
a generational trend, because our generation has been a generation that has, in schools, preached self-esteem, anti-bullying, safety, precautionary principle. All of these things came from our lot.
What can we do about it?
So, this is an argument that I now might have even with you, but I mean, I suppose my argument is an incomplete argument, but my argument is that what we shouldn't do is be overly glib or flippant about it.
But it's so much fun taking the piss out of these little horrors.
We also have to be very careful about playing them at their own game, because there's always a tendency to kind of, they call us out, we call them out.
Well, we say if you want us to wear sombreros, then you can't eat our Western food, kind of thing.
There's that, and there's also the kind of we play the victim card. You've destroyed this person's reputation, and then we kind of go down that. Then we kind of try and make them out to be the bullies, and and you just end up with kind of trading who's more vile than the next person. I think there's a kind of interesting idea that what you need to do is to kind of use humour, and I get all that, but I'm not very enthusiastic about some of the kind of, feminism is cancer kind of speaking tools.
You're raising the spectre of Milo here.
I am, of course. And of course, let me say about Milo. Milo has said some very fine things over the years, and I can't but disagree.
Yeah.
But somehow I don't want to create our own echo chamber. That's what I'm wary of, right? What I think is much more difficult. So I think, creating a tribe of people who hate the social justice warriors is far too easy for me. I think all of that it doesn't confront anything. And actually, I'll bet you anything, and I genuinely mean this, I'll bet you anything that a lot of the people who are in our tribe will suddenly go, yes, but you can't say that about the mentally ill. I mean, you'd be amazed, right, how thin-skinned they can be on certain topics, right? So actually confronting the kind of therapeutic ethos and the kind of the safety consciousness and all of those things. I mean, what I actually say in the book, which is ridiculous, is we need to allow young people to develop a new model of what a personality is. Because to a certain extent, the model person today is a victim, is oppressed. Who do you aspire to be when you grow up? It's like, I want to be the person who can claim victimhood, right? Who wants to be a white, straight guy today, right? And then if you're a white straight guy, you've got to find victim points, otherwise you're in trouble. So people are competing with each other to find ways of kind of saying, I should be listened to more, because that's one of the things that is the outcome of this, which is identity politics means that you gain the right to be heard and silence other people the more victim points you've got.
Yes, I've got no victim, but I tried the other day. I did have gay sex with boys at my prep school, but I don't think that counts anymore. I mean, being gay is not good enough these days.
No, but you would need to pose it in a different way. But you could say that you were I had a troubled youth.
Yes,
and I had a troubled youth, and not everybody understood me. And
yes, that's it.
I mean, there are ways of doing
Claire,
it.
You're helping me.
Yeah, I mean, that's the worst thing.
Do you think my voice could be heard more clearly among the
but it's also the case that we all kind of tend to do it. I have rows all the time with feminists, and they'll say, about rape, particularly about rape culture, which I think is a completely nonsense term, and then about and they're sort of saying things, and I want to say, of course everybody wants to say, if you only knew what I've been through.
Yes.
Right, and you want to kind of drag out your personal experiences to kind of trump them on the how much you've suffered stuff, right? Yeah. And you can't. I know it's the wrong thing to do.
You haven't been raped. Oh, is it right? Yes, okay, yeah, I know.
Meaningful silence.
Yes, meaningful silence. Yeah.
The point I'm saying is that why should I drag all that stuff up?
Well,
right?
indeed.
What I'm saying is that people go there. You don't get to my age and not have suffered things, right?
Yeah.
It would be mad.
Exactly.
So you could
bad shit happens to us all.
Bad shit happens, and you could sit down and go, all this has happened to me.
Yeah.
And you could represent yourself as a victim of things.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in ideas, blah blah blah. But that's all I'm saying is the temptation is there, isn't it, to present oneself in that light.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to Delingpole with me, James Delingpole. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes. You can download new episodes every Thursday on Podcast One. You can also listen to it at Breitbart.com. Thank you so much again for listening, and remember to subscribe on iTunes, and don't forget, give me the 5-star review I so totally deserve. Thank you, my friends. Till next week. Bye-bye.